Good afternoon to everyone. Today's webinar is one of the series of 4 that are planned for the next 4 days. Secretary Health could not be here today. Madam Aarti Ahuja, Additional Secretary Health, will be presiding over the webinar. I welcome Professor Dr. Jayalal today, who is President IMA, and also our experts from AIIMS, Dr. Randeep Guleria, Dr. Anjan Trika, Dr. Anant Mohan, Dr. Manish Suneja, Dr. Neeraj Nischal, and the speaker for the day, Dr. Saurabh Mittal, who is Assistant Professor, Department of Pulmonary, Critical Care and Sleep Medicines. I request Madam Aarti Ahuja to say a few words, please.
Thank you. And I would like to welcome the President IMA, Dr. Guleria and his team, and all the participants from across the country who are present here today. Welcome to this webinar, which is being organized by the ministry along in close collaboration with the IMA. As you all know that in this COVID pandemic, whether we talk of the first wave or the second wave, we've had a whole of society approach and had very, very good collaboration and support all across the board, whether it is private sector or public sector or people running their own clinics in the districts, private testing labs, private manufacturers. So across the board, there has been a joint effort in fighting this pandemic, which all of us truly appreciate. And the role of IMA has been commendable. We have been getting the inputs of IMA on various policy issues, on operational issues, which have proven very helpful to us as we went along this path together. So I would really like to welcome all of you once again and echo the sentiments of all my colleagues about the kind of work that we have done together. Now, coming to this webinar, as you may be aware that we have been having these kind of webinars or online training programs for hospitals and doctors across the country. AIIMS is our center of excellence at the national level, and under Dr. Guleria's leadership and with his excellent team of doctors who have been incidentally very closely involved with the making of the national clinical management protocols, evidence-based protocols that have been displayed on the ministry's website. So this Center of Excellence, AIIMS Delhi, they have been training every Tuesday and every Friday, online trainings on different aspects of COVID management across the country. They have trained thousands of doctors, both in the public and in the private sector. This is an ongoing exercise. Simultaneously, centers of excellence have been formed in different state governments, which have participation of representatives of the private sector as well as the public sector. They in turn have been training other people. So it has been a collaborative exercise and an exercise at mutual learning and taking forward the efforts. So as a continuation of that, now we see that the pandemic is evolving in different ways. You have been reading about the different variants of concern that have been found through the genome sequencing efforts also. So the pandemic is moving in different ways and we have to be alert. We have to be proactive so that we can respond effectively and we can respond in time. So as a continuation of that knowledge sharing, today is the first in the series of webinars that will be done by AIIMS faculty. The idea is that this is but a first step, and the people who attend the webinar today should in turn see it as a training of trainers and then disseminate this to other people in the states, in the districts, so that the knowledge does not remain contained at with one set of people. So that is the expectation, and this is definitely not the first of such kind. We will be having more of these webinars. We'll be having in conjunction and collaboration with IMA, And we can also look at specific topics later on. We know that now there is a spread in the rural areas in the second wave, which was not so much seen in the first wave. So the rural management protocols have been put on the ministry's website, and there is a slight difference in approach there. The pediatric management protocols are also there on the ministry's website. So a lot of new things keep on happening as we go by, and we are very happy to support and to work together on further dissemination of different issues that you may feel need to be addressed through these webinars. So I would like to at this juncture also thank not just the IMA for having come together, organized the participants and brought them together. I'm sure this webinar and the ones that are to follow will be of use to everybody because they also dispel a lot of myths. There could be a lot of knowledge gaps. So thank you, IMA, for coming forward for this. But I'd also like to thank the team at AIIMS Delhi that has been working very hard, not just in looking after patients, but also disseminating the knowledge in a very, very effective manner all across the country. So under Dr. Guleria's leadership and his team, thank you so much for being part of this and for always being so ready and willing to share your knowledge and your experience with the rest of the country. I'm sure it makes a lot of difference in the way we have been managing the cases so far and will continue to manage the cases in future as well. So thank you once again. It's a great pleasure to be here and wish you all the very best. Thank you.
I now request Dr. Jailal, President IMA, if he's there with us, he could kindly speak a few words. Dr. Randeep Guleria, Director AIIMS. Sir, may I kindly request you to we will start the proceedings now. If,
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for your kind words, madam. And one of the mandates of AIIMS is to be an academic institute and be able to provide academic and support in terms of knowledge sharing to various institutes across the country. So Dr. Jailal and the president of IMA and all the other colleagues of IMA, it's indeed a pleasure for us from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences to be holding this webinar as part of the Clinical Excellence Program. As has already been said, that this is a new viral infection and this is a pandemic which has evolved over the last 1.5 years. And because of that, there is a need for all of us to learn more and more as to how best we can manage patients as far as COVID-19 is concerned. Although the cases in our country luckily are coming down, but things have always been unexpected. This is a moving pandemic. We still have significant number of cases in certain parts of our country. And as has been said, there is now a movement of the pandemic more and more into rural India. And that is why there is a huge role that IMA can play in terms of providing quality care as far as patients of COVID-19 are concerned. The basic aim of these programs is to work together, to talk to each other, to work as a team, to decrease our mortality. We should really work in seeing that no one dies because of COVID-19, and we are providing the optimum care. The knowledge as far as COVID is concerned is changing as we speak. I remember 1 year ago, there was a whole discussion of giving hydroxychloroquine. There was issues of giving other drugs like lopinavir, ritonavir. But we've all come a long ways from that time to now newer drugs which have come in and newer molecules coming in, including monoclonal antibodies and other things. But again, it's important for us to understand holistically what is the place of all of these drugs. I've always maintained that in COVID-19, two things are very important: knowing the right drugs and knowing when to give the right drugs. We've seen that with steroids. In mild cases, you don't need to give steroids, but there can be life-saving in moderate to severe patients with COVID-19. The same is true for remdesivir. You don't need to give it in mild cases, but it may be useful in moderate to severe disease in limited number of patients. And also as far as other drugs are concerned, which are useful for the cytokine storm. So knowing the drugs is one thing, but knowing when to give these drugs so that we don't cause harm to our patients is also a very important thing. And as we learn about COVID-19, it's important that we upgrade our knowledge and try and do the best for our patients in whatever circumstances that we are. It's challenging. It's easier for us sometimes to say that you do this in a tertiary care hospital, but I know it's challenging when you're at a primary center, and we have to be innovative at times to find solutions depending on what is available with us. I would like to really say that the aim of this webinars are to have a talk, but have more and more interactive sessions, discuss and with the colleagues across the country and see what are the issues that they're facing. Can we find a solution for them? Can we really see how best we can treat our patients no matter where they are in urban, rural, or in any part of the country? So I'm really grateful that we have a nice and a very eminent faculty that is going to be there today. We have Dr. Saurabh Mittal, who will be talking on home isolation, selecting eligible patients, home care, referral to hospitals, monitoring and medication, covering all of the things that is required before you have a patient coming to the hospital. What is home isolation all about? Remember, 80 to 85% of our patients can be managed at home only. But the important issue is that there are going to be about 15% of patients who will need to come to hospital. How do we decide out of these 85% of patients who is really going down that road, and when do we decide how to really send this patient to the hospital so that there is good referral and we don't really cause higher mortality because there's over-reliance on home care? To really help me as far as the panel discussion is concerned, we have Dr. Anjan Trikha, Dr. Anant Mohan, Dr. Manish Suneja, and Dr. Neeraj Nischal, and I'm grateful to all of them for sparing their time. So without wasting much time, I'll ask Dr. Saurabh Mittal to start with his presentation, after which we can have a panel discussion and we can have questions from the audience. You can even put your questions on the chat box so that we can answer, we can address them if you have any as the talk goes along. So over to you, Dr. Saurabh Mittal.
Thank you, sir. So I'll just share my screen here. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So in today's webinar, in next 15 to 20 minutes, we will be discussing about the mild COVID-19, how to identify the patients for home isolation, and how do we advise them for home isolation management, and when do we ask them to come to the hospital. So this is a very important aspect of management of COVID-19 because it applies to the majority of patients with COVID. And the patients to hospital. So what is COVID-19? We all understand that COVID-19 is a viral respiratory illness that is caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The important thing is it is predominantly a respiratory illness, and the severity of disease can vary from mild infection, asymptomatic infection, to a critically ill patient. So there is a wide spectrum of the manifestation of disease. And before we go on to that, how do we do home isolation? The important thing remains, why do we do home isolation, and how do we prevent the spread of disease? So we have to understand how do COVID-19 spread. So there are basically three important ways COVID-19 spreads. The most important way is by the droplets. That means whenever a patient who is infected with COVID-19 or has a SARS-CoV-2 virus in his respiratory secretions, coughs out or speaks, produces some droplets which are there in the air, and they can be inhaled by another person. So these droplets kind of stay there for 15-20 minutes, and after some time they tend to settle down. So the duration is important, that these droplets are remaining in the air, and that during that time they can be inhaled by the another person and causing the infection. Another way is by the fomites. That means once these droplets are in the air, they can fall onto the objects, whichever the touching surface, telephone, mobile, keyboards. So they can fall on these surfaces, Whenever someone touches those surfaces and then he touches his mouth or nose, he can have the virus into his respiratory. But this fomite transmission is a very small proportion of transmission. The predominant transmission is by the droplets. The third route, which has kind of come up over last 6 months or so, and now the CDC has also agreed to this, that the virus can stay in air for a longer time. That means droplets stay there for 15-20 minutes, but even after that, virus can stay in the air and can be inhaled. So that is called as the airborne route. So these are the three routes by which virus spreads. So the basic concept of isolation in a patient who is infectious is that you don't allow virus from one person to spread to others by any of these routes. So this forms the principle of home isolation. The patient should not be allowed to spread the virus through any of these routes. So what happens if we have a very large number of population which is getting infected with COVID-19? We need to have a policy to have asymptomatic and mild cases being managed at home, because we need to preserve the limited hospital beds for moderate and severely ill patients. Secondly, if we isolate these patients at home, we prevent the spread of infection into the community. So these are the two main reasons for advocating home isolation for patients with coronavirus disease. So now, before we start about the home isolation, I'll put up 3 cases, and then during the talk, we'll discuss how do we do home isolation. And then in the end, we'll have some answer that how do we choose a patient for home isolation. So first patient is a 35-year-old male who is a doctor without any comorbidities, who is presented with 3 days fever and has a saturation of 97% on room air. He lives in a 2-bedroom house with wife and 1 child. So this is case 1. Then another lady who is a 58-year-old lady, she has some comorbidities and her saturation is 95%. She lives in a 3-bedroom bathroom with husband and 2 children. So this is the second patient. And the third patient is a 40-year-old male who is a post-renal transplant on immunosuppression and has a saturation of 93%. So we have these 3 case scenarios. So once we have gone through the ideal selection for a patient for COVID-19 home isolation, we'll come back that what is the correct patient for home isolation. So before we go for home isolation, we have to understand that the disease categorization is the key for correct management. Means once you have a patient who has been tested positive for SARS-CoV-2 virus, we have to divide him into a clinical category of mild disease, moderate disease, or a severe disease. So mild disease is characterized by a patient who may have upper respiratory tract symptoms or fever, but does not have shortness of breath or hypoxemia. That means patient has a room air saturation, pulse oxygen saturation, which is more than 93%, and he does not have any shortness of breath. So these are the patients who are categorized as mild disease. And these are the patients who should be taken up for home isolation. Here it is very important to understand that disease has a dynamic process. Means a patient who has been today classified as mild may progress to a moderate disease in 3 days or a severe disease in 5 days. So that means this categorization at one point of time is actually not valid. If a patient who has started his illness day 5 or day 6 has a mild illness, may progress. So that means it has to be a continuous monitoring and continuous categorization of the disease, that whether the patient has complete course of mild disease or whether course went from a mild disease to a moderate or a severe disease. Because that's where the home isolation has to be stopped and patient needs to be hospitalized. So what are the prerequisites for home isolation? So any patient who has been clinically assigned as a mild or an asymptomatic patient can be for home isolation. Patients should have a facility of their residence for self-isolation. We'll see what is self-isolation and what are the prerequisites for that. Patients who have immunocompromised status such as HIV disease, patients who are on cancer therapy, or transplant recipients are not recommended for home isolation initially, but they may be given a home isolation after proper evaluation by the treating doctor while they are in continuous touch with their primary clinician. Elderly individuals, that is patients who have aged more than 60 years of age, individuals who have comorbidities such as hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, chronic lung disease, chronic liver or chronic kidney disease, or cerebrovascular disease, they should also be clinically evaluated by a clinician before a home isolation is allowed. Because these are the patients who are at risk of worsening and developing a severe disease. For home isolation, the person should have a caregiver which is available in the house to provide care to the patient on a 24/7 basis. Means you cannot allow one person to just stay in his own room and there is no one to take care of. And another important thing is that there should be a communication link between the caregiver and the hospital. Means whosoever is isolated, the person who is taking care of that person should have access to a hospital, and they should be in communication with the treating doctor or treating nurse or the treating team during the entire duration of home isolation, so that they can get the proper advice for the patient. So whenever a patient is asked for home isolation, what is expected from the patient is the patient should have their information and a care, their number, healthcare facilities, whom to contact, and what are the emergency numbers at that time. And they should have their support network at home, like their family, friends, who should be informed and who should know when to call the patient. They are in regular touch with the patient. So that is from the patient side they should do. Also, they should have their regular supply of medications, masks, as well as disinfectants. Patient should have a separate room and separate space and keep distance from the others. And patient should have a support for the regular need. Means patient, if needs some groceries at home, they need to be transported to the hospital if there are other family members. So these are the things which are expected and should be understood by the patient while they are being allowed home isolation. They should understand and follow this. So what are the important instructions from the medical point of view the patient should get while they are asked for home isolation? So these are into various categories like physical distancing, proper mask use, hand washing, self-monitoring, symptomatic management, how do we do, and they should stay in contact with the healthcare provider. Physical distancing means patient must stay in an identified room with an attached bathroom, and there should be no one else staying in the same room. Ideally, the room should be a well-ventilated room with a cross ventilation. Patient should stay away from other people in home, specifically elderly and those with comorbid conditions should stay away from the patient. And patient should not share any of the personal items with other people. Patient should use a triple layer surgical mask at all times. This is to prevent the spread of disease into the family members. And patient should discard the mask after 8 hours of use, or even earlier if the mask is wet or it is visibly soiled. And mask should be disinfected with 1% bleach solution, that is the sodium hypochlorite, before it is thrown away. So that is very important. The patients who are allowed home isolation should have a disinfectant with them. A correct use of mask is very important for the home isolation as well as for preventing the community spread. The important points for a mask wearing is that it should cover your mouth, nose, and chin. You should pinch the metal edge over your nose. And if you remove a mask, you should hold it from the ear loop and never touch the front of your mask. And then it should be disinfected and thrown away. So that's how the persons who are in home isolation should use a mask correctly. Now comes the point of hand washing and cleaning for these individuals. So hands must be washed often with soap and water for at least 40 seconds, or clean them with the alcohol-based sanitizer if they are not visibly soiled. And the patient the room in which patient is staying, the surfaces should be cleaned with 1% hypochlorite solution. So these are the things which are required from the patient side to prevent the spread of disease. Now we come to the patient's management. So patient should be asked to monitor his symptoms and some of other parameters. That means patient should make a chart like this, They should make a time, and every 4 hourly they should measure their temperature. They should use a pulse oximeter from which they can get two readings, that is the pulse oxygen saturation as well as the heart rate. Along with this, patient should also report how are they feeling, if they are feeling better, if they are feeling same, or if they are feeling that they are getting worse. Similarly, the patient should report that their breathing is fine or it is getting worse. And if there is any worsening in any of these parameters, patient should communicate it to the healthcare provider with whom the caregiver is in contact. So it is very important that this monitoring chart is maintained on a regular basis and it is not kind of forgotten or missed by the clinician or by the patient. So whilst a patient is home isolated, pulse oximeter has a very important role to play in monitoring the patient. So it is important that patient should be explained that how do you use a pulse oximeter correctly. So first of all, you should remove any nail polish or false nails if you have. You should ensure that you are sitting at least for 5 minutes before you taking the measurements, because sometimes patient may have some degree of dyspnea or worsening and the readings, rest readings may not be correct. So you should keep your hand still while you use the pulse oximeter and keep it in place for at least a minute or maybe even longer if the reading is fluctuating. The reading should be taken when it has been stable for at least of 5 seconds. Because there is a lot of confusion from the patient side that the readings from the pulse oximeter keeps varying. If you have a hand who is still and the reading and the pulse oximeter readings have stabilized, then only you take the reading as a correct record for monitoring purposes. Now we come to the what are the instructions for family members. The caregiver who is taking care of the patient should wear a triple layer mask within the house. But if they have to enter the room in which patient is there, they should possibly wear a N95 mask. The caregiver should maintain hand hygiene before wearing and after removing the mask. After coming in contact with the patient or the immediate surroundings, they should use soap and water for at least 40 seconds, and they can also use alcohol-based hand rubs if not visible swelling of the hands. The family members should avoid direct contact with patient secretions, but if they have to do it, they should wear disposable gloves while handling the patient secretions. They should avoid exposure to the potentially contaminated items. So patient, the room in which patient is staying, there are some items which may have contamination like formaldehyde, such as utensils, dishes, drinks, used towels or bed lilies, and they should not be shared and should be cleaned and disinfected before being used by the other person. Food should be provided to the patient in his own room. The utensils and dishes which are used by the patient should be cleaned with soap, detergent, soap and water. And they should clean their hands after taking off gloves or after handling the used items by the patient. It is very important that the family members understand, because this is the basic purpose of home isolation, that the family members don't get infected from the patient. And they should use triple layer medical mask and the disposable gloves while cleaning or handling the surfaces, clothing or the linen which is used by the patient. Now coming to the medical management for the patient. So patient should communicate the monitoring chart to the treating physician and should promptly report if there is any decline in the patient's status. If patient has any comorbid conditions, the medications should be continued, such as controlled diabetes, hypertension, or any other thyroid illness. So those medications should be told to the clinician at the initiation of home isolation, and they should be continued during the home isolation. Patient must take rest and he should take adequate fluids to maintain the hydration. The fluid intake may vary depending upon patient's requirement, but the patient should also not take excessive fluid. Means a patient who has fever will have a lot of insensible loss, so their fluid intake may need to be increased, but patients who do not have very high fever, their fluid intake may be somewhere around 1.5 liters per day. For fever management, patient can take paracetamol tablet in the form of 500 milligrams to 650 milligrams up to 4 times a day, which can be taken safely. Sometimes may add any other NSAID such as naproxen if fever is persistent even after taking paracetamol. patients may perform, if they have throat pain, they may perform warm saline gargles twice daily. For upper respiratory symptoms, they may use steam inhalation for a few minutes. Also for cough, they can use antitussive cough syrups. May consider taking the use of vitamin C and zinc. And for patients who have excessive throat pain or congestion, they can use tablet levocetirizine 5 milligrams once or twice daily. So we have to understand that all these measures, none of these is absolute. The patient has to do it. All of these are for symptomatic patients. So patient, if has symptoms, they can take levocetirizine. If they have throat pain, they can use warm saline gargles. It is not essential that everybody who is in home isolation has to do warm saline gargle, has to take inhalation steam for 3-4 times a day. So those are not essential. These are for symptomatic management only. Now coming to the specific management for COVID-19. So one drug which can be given for these patients is tablet ivermectin, which is in the dose of 200 microgram per kg, which is usually around 12 milligram per day for 3 to 5. Patients who have excessive cough, they can take inhaler budesonide 400 microgram 2 puffs twice daily with a spacer, or they can also use a dry powder inhaler for 5 to 7 days. So these are the two important medications which can be given for patients with COVID-19 during home isolation. What about other drugs? So that is a very important thing, that any other drugs such as remdesivir or any other investigational therapy should only be given by a medical professional and given in the hospital setting. Means patients should not try to get and administer remdesivir at home. Patients should not take systemic oral steroids for mild disease. However, if patients have symptoms such as persistent fever or worsening of cough, after 7 days of illness, they can consult the doctor for treatment with low-dose oral systemic steroids. So this is something which was new, which came around 2 months back. Because of the persistent fever, patients can take low-dose oral steroids even in mild disease. But this has to be prescribed by a medical practitioner, and just after at least 7 days of illness have gone and fever is persistent. The dose for oral steroids in such setting would be for dexamethasone, it will be around 6 milligrams per once daily. For methylprednisolone, 16 milligram twice daily, and for a prednisolone preparation, around 40 milligrams. So this can be given for 3 to 5 days, depending upon the persistence of fever or other symptoms. And patients should stay in contact with the healthcare provider. And when should they ask for a hospitalization? If they have difficulty in breathing, if there is any fall in oxygen saturation, that is pulse oxygen saturation has gone to below 94% on room air. Patients have persistent pain or pressure in the chest, or they have mental confusion or inability to arouse. In case of these things, an immediate help should be sought from the healthcare provider, and patient should be taken to a hospital. For individuals who have high risk features such as hypertension, diabetes, chronic illnesses such as respiratory, kidney or liver disease, coronary artery disease, CVA, immunocompromised or elderly, if at all these individuals are allowed home isolation, you should have a lower threshold for getting them to hospital. The low threshold means that they should be monitored, and on any suspicion of any worsening, they should be immediately taken to hospital rather than waiting for things to worsen. So it is important for individuals who have comorbidities, they should have a low threshold for hospitalization and seeking the help of a healthcare provider. So now, when do we discontinue home isolation? So any patient who has completed 10 days from the onset of illness and has not had fever for at least 3 days can come out of home isolation. That means at least patient should be afebrile for at least 3 days and 10 days from the disease onset has happened. And there is no need to do a repeat testing to end home isolation. So this is also important to understand. A lot of patients may ask for a repeat test. It is not required. So now we come back to the cases which we discussed. The first patient, he was a 35-year-old male doctor with fever and a maintained saturation. So he is an ideal candidate for a home isolation. The second patient we have is a 58-year-old lady with hypertension, diabetes, saturation is still maintained, and she has a facility for home isolation. She may be allowed home isolation, but she should be closely monitored in view of the comorbidities. And the third patient is an immunosuppressed individual with a saturation of 93% and should not be allowed the home isolation. So that means every patient should be assessed individually. Means sometimes what will happen, a family may have 3 or 4 patients at home, and they will say that we all will stay in home isolation. But every individual should be individually assessed for the presence of comorbidities and saturation and other parameters before an entire family can be allowed home isolation. Means every member has to be assessed individually, and some of them may require hospitalization, while others may be managed at home. So now just concluding things from my talk, that what is essential is that you have to categorize the severity of disease, which is key for proper management. We should provide the correct instructions to the patient and the caregiver for during the home isolation, and explain them the danger signs when they should seek help from a medical practitioner. And there should be a continued communication with the healthcare provider, and it is helpful in getting the patient to hospital in time and is key to successful outcome following home isolation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saurav Mittal, for a presentation and overview of the issues of home isolation, who should be doing home isolation, and what are the challenges as far as home isolation is concerned, and who should not be doing home isolation. While we wait for questions, so if you have any questions, either you can put them on the chat box or you can raise your hand and we'll try and address those questions as we go along. But while we wait for questions, I'll ask this. I have a question which I'm going to start the panel discussion, and I'll start with Dr. Anant Mohan. And I'll ask him that there is a lot of concern currently about other drugs which are being used as antivirals, like favipiravir. So what is your take, and should we give patients with mild disease drugs like favipiravir or hydroxychloroquine as mild management of patients with mild COVID-19 infection who are in home isolation?
Yes, sir. So last year when the pandemic started, when we really did not know much about this, then the tendency was to try whatever antivirals were available and had probably worked against some earlier viruses, like at the time of the MERS and the SARS. So in a hope that they would either prevent or decrease the viral load, these drugs were used. And like you said, the favipiravir were used, and they were used quite extensively for several months at several centers, in fact, almost all over the country, for especially for mild disease, also mild to moderate disease, both, whether in hospital or at home. Now, the evidence for favipiravir is pretty slim, and even earlier the studies were not at all robustly conducted, and that is why it never found a proper place in any of the national guidelines at any point of time. And even now, in fact, most of the drugs which were earlier used last year have now been deleted from the national guidelines, which were just published a couple of weeks back, because of lack of robust evidence to their benefit. And there are some side effects also of all these drugs which have to be taken into account. For example, and hydroxychloroquine also the same way. It was used very extensively for mild disease, even for moderate disease, as a preventive role. However, they have not really been substantiated to that effect so as to make it as a guideline for routine recommendation, and that is why they are not currently a part. So these are the two drugs, and hydroxychloroquine had its other side effects along with azithromycin. So all these QT prolongations, etc. So basically, these antivirals as of now are not routinely kind of used and not recommended in any of the guidelines in India or even in the States.
Okay, thank you very much. And For the subsequent questions, I'll really ask Dr. Rajiv Kumar, our associate, doing to go through them. We have now a lot of questions on the chat box, so we can try and answer them. And in between, if someone really has a question, don't hesitate. Please just raise your hand and we'll try and answer them.
Thank you, sir. I'll just outline how we handle these questions and how we've done them in the past. So there are certain members who are on the panel who already have the ability to ask their questions. They can just unmute themselves and ask the questions. For all other attendees who don't have a speaking privilege, they are welcome to add their questions to the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll take those questions. We will restrict the Q&A to questions that specifically relate to the topic that's being discussed today. Often we get questions which obviously relate to COVID, but are beyond what is being discussed today, and we will take them up on the webinars which pertain to those topics. So we'll try and keep the questions to ones which are specific to the topic being discussed today. So the first question is the 6-minute walk test. What is its role and what is its value? So, Saurabh, you want to address that?
Saurabh, would you like to address that?
Yes, sir. So 6-minute walk test during home isolation is also being tried by a lot of individuals. So for individuals who have a mild disease and are stable, they really don't need to perform a 6-minute walk test. But patients who have comorbidities or are at risk of developing a severe disease, they may perform a 6-minute walk test. And if they have a desaturation means if their oxygen level falls 4% or more after walking for 6 minutes, it is an indication that they may be at risk of worsening the disease and it should be reported. A desaturation on 6-minute walk test really does not mean that you need to get hospitalized immediately, but it should be reported to your clinician, and frequent monitoring should be done so that it should be caught in time that if you are getting worse.
Okay, if I may just add, you see, 6-minute walk test is something which is used a lot by pulmonologists and clinicians in a hospital setting. I mean, it evolved from what was known as a 12-minute walk test and became a 6-minute walk test. The issue is that if there are definite guidelines of how to do a 6-minute walk test, there are ATS guidelines published in terms of how to do it. Now, when you ask a patient to do it at home, you're not sure that he's doing it in a proper manner, whether he's walking briskly for 6 minutes, is he doing it in a proper manner? And sometimes the oximeter that you use may not be that well calibrated that it may give you a reading which is not that accurate. So I don't think that it is still a validated test that we can use, but it is being used a lot during the pandemic and therefore it can be applied, but it should be interpreted with, I would say, a pinch of salt. But it can be used. It is used by a lot of clinicians who just see that in a person who is borderline with comorbidities, it may really be one red flag that you can think of that, okay, if there is on walking the saturation is showing more than 4% fall, then it is something that you need to be concerned about. But very often you will have people who will say that they climb a flight of stairs and are all right. And when they do this 6-minute walk test, because the oximeter is not reading well, because even if you ask a normal person to use the oximeter, it starts off sometime with 93, 94, and then builds up to 96, 97. So they get confused. Should they look at 93 as the value or should they look at 97? So it's very important to be able to explain things to the patient who's at home isolation. Remember, they are in a panic stage. They are worried. Many of them are concerned that they may have a serious disease and are not sure whether they should be in hospital. So I think along with asking them to the test, interpreting it is important, and reassurance is also an important part.
Thank you, sir. I'll club the next two questions.
There is one.
Yeah. I would
Please
like
go
to
ahead.
ask a question. Yes, sir. Sir, this is on the point of view as a clinician. Is it that suppose a patient having mild COVID and then if the test is positive, the 6-minute test, is it one criteria to go for CT scan chest immediately?
No, that criteria is not there. So there is again no evidence that if you have a fall in oxygen saturation on 6-minute walk test, you should do a CT scan. There is no evidence to suggest that this is an indication for a CT scan. And like I told you, the 6-minute walk test itself has to be validated in a home setting. We have a lot of tests which are done in hospital setting, and we are extrapolating them into home setting where they are not being validated and the methodology is not clear because, if you look at the protocol for 6-minute walk test, it has to be a long corridor of a particular length. You have to walk up and down that corridor. You have to make sure that you walk briskly. Patients don't do that at home, and therefore you're not even sure whether the test has been done properly.
Right. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Right. So we'll take the next two questions. Then I'll put them together because they both relate to drug therapy at home. So the rationale of both ivermectin and azithromycin. So maybe we could cover both of those drugs at the same time in home setting.
So maybe we can ask Dr. Manish to cover that.
So the two drugs, ivermectin and azithromycin. Azithromycin, really no data at all to support its use. Actually, it may be harmful, so it should not be used. Ivermectin, I would say the final word probably has not been said yet. 5 days back, there's a new publication in American Journal of Therapeutics, the latest systematic review, which shows benefit in terms of mortality with ivermectin, but the confidence interval is very wide. The data certainty of evidence is moderate, low to moderate. So as of now, what stands is ivermectin as such, we do not have any definite evidence, a definite rationale for its use in preventing progression to severe disease or mortality, but there's some suggestions in studies, and there are a large number of studies of some possible benefit with ivermectin. So being a very safe drug, across many studies it has been used across many decades, side effects are very low. So still it is being used, particularly in people with mild disease who have risk factors for progression to moderate to severe disease. So that is a small subgroup of patients where it may be used still.
And there's one more drug which has come up, Manish, doxy again. So I thought you could cover all of them in one go.
So doxycycline again, it has been said that it has an immunomodulator action, which may be useful in COVID. So now it is a very indirect way of doing things. So we have in our national protocol also now we have budesonide and all those things, NSAIDs, strong NSAID. So again, doxycycline has no role as of today in management of COVID-19.
And I'm going to keep you here for one more question on medication, and that is budesonide. So which day should you be starting budesonide?
So if we see that there are two trials on which use of budesonide has been recommended upon. So they have used it pretty early in the first week of illness. And they have done a subgroup analysis wherein it has been shown benefits are there in both given early and late, and it is more pronounced when given late. So when in the national protocol it was incorporated for patient groups who were persistently symptomatic beyond 5 days of illness. The rationale was that giving too early a steroid in the throat, there are chances of viral replication to persist. So to take care of that issue, it was recommended to be given beyond 5 days. And as it is, nearly 75% to 80% of patients become asymptomatic by 5 days. So it would just be in those 15 to 20% patients wherein it would be recommended beyond 5 days of illness.
So if I may just add, one thing is there, we must remember that, as Manish said, majority of our mild patients will get all right with just symptomatic treatment. So the issue is, when should we give these drugs? For ivermectin, there is some data, and as you said, if you look at the safety profile, it's a very safe drug. The benefit is still evolving, and how useful it is, I would say we still need more data. But whatever little data we have really suggests that if you do a risk-benefit analysis, maybe you could say that there is no risk and it may have some benefits, so it's worthwhile to consider because it is also cost-effective. The challenge, of course, is as far as timing of other drugs is concerned. When should you give inhaled steroids? If you give it too early, is there a chance of causing increase in viral replication? No data one way or the other, but the guidelines do mention that you should give it a little later because many patients may become all right on their own and may not even require it. Sometimes you even continue to give it later on if patients have persistent, intractable or chronic cough, because it may help in decreasing a little bit of bronchial hyperreactivity.
Right, sir. A couple of questions that now relate to home isolation. So the first is, do people in contact with a positive patient as home contacts need to be tested? Or do people who, when should people who've come in a high risk contact with a positive patient get themselves tested if they're asymptomatic? So do the family members need to get tested if they're asymptomatic? And do people who are not in the family but are otherwise exposed to a positive patient need to get tested?
So maybe Neeraj can try and answer that question.
So this is a very important question from the point of view that if somebody is in contact and is asymptomatic, that patient should definitely isolate himself or herself, because that is one way this infection spreads outside the household. So if somebody is in contact, he or she should treat himself as infected unless proved otherwise. So if the patient is asymptomatic, maybe they can get tested after 3 to 5 days. But if symptom starts, the same day they should get tested. And if they are symptomatic and they still turn negative, they should get this test repeated after a few days, because what we have seen that the infectiveness of this particular virus is very high. And if you are close contact, especially household member, then chances of you getting this infection is very high. So treat yourself as infected. Even if you are asymptomatic, wait for at least 3 to 5 days. Keep yourself isolated till you are proven that no, you don't have this infection.
Right.
Okay.
Thanks, Neeraj.
So normally one would say that if you are a close contact or a household contact, you don't get yourself tested on day 1 unless you have symptoms. Usually wait till the 5th day and then get tested after the 5th day, 5th to 7th day, because that is the usual incubation period that would be required. And you may get a false sense of security if you test yourself on the same day. You may still be in the incubation period.
Right, sir. Now, some of these patients with COVID will have hemoptysis. So what are the specific points in managing hemoptysis in a patient with COVID?
Okay, Dr. Anand Mohan can try and address hemoptysis in COVID.
Well, so basically, one, we'll have to try and find out the actual etiology, because COVID normally by itself should not be the primary cause of hemoptysis. It causes cough, it may cause sputum, breathing difficulty, hypoxia, ARDS also. So that may happen. Pneumonia, of course, severe pneumonia sometimes may cause streaky hemoptysis. But if it is anything beyond that, then one will have to try and do the appropriate imaging and try and find out the history in the past also, a history of tuberculosis, a history of bronchiectasis, or any other condition which may lead to hemoptysis. And that will have to be seen by X-ray, or in this case, CT scan will have to be done. And then based upon that, we'll have to take a call on the appropriate management. By and large, every non-massive hemoptysis can be dealt with medically, most often than not by giving a mixture of hemostatics, antibiotics, or one should also rule out fungal infection, as per Gilloma is a very, in today's situation, fungal infections are everywhere. And Aspergilloma is a very well-known cause of hemoptysis. So all this has to be done. If at all we don't find a cause or the person is continuously bleeding, then using all appropriate precautions, one may have to go inside and do a bronchoscopy to find out from which part this is coming from, and then take it from there. So that becomes the last approach, because in COVID, obviously, one doesn't normally do a bronchoscopy, but in intractable or unexplained hemoptysis, one might have to do it in using all proper precautions.
Right.
Okay.
One will have to investigate for tuberculosis. Sorry, tuberculosis also needs to be ruled out, active tuberculosis.
Correct. One is rule out tuberculosis. The third is make sure the person has not been put on anticoagulants by someone else, because that is also something people do as a knee-jerk reaction.
Dr. Anjan wanted to say something, sir?
Anjan, you're mute. Yeah.
Yes, I've just come across a couple of cases in home isolation who've had so much of kala and steam inhalation that they have developed some ulcers in their throat, and once they cough out, they tend to have some streaks of blood coming in, and then the first thing is something is wrong. But then if you take a history, they have been taking jugs full of that spicy kala which is available, and steam inhalation maybe every 3 hours. Most of these cases I have come across, their friends or relatives are from Maharashtra, because maybe there are so many in numbers at that time. One has to be aware of the fact that these kala may work. It is there in the Ayush guidelines, but everything has to be in moderation, and steam inhalation is not to the level that the moment you go out and get some vegetables, come back and take steam for half an hour and you think everything goes off. I just thought I'd share it with everybody.
Well, that's, I think, a very important point, because sometimes you have to look at the upper airways rather than just the lower airways. And many of the local medications can cause ulceration in the upper airways, which can also look like hemoptysis.
The next question is about pregnancy. So is pregnancy with mild symptomatic COVID an indication for admission? Irrespective of the trimester, it's a pregnant woman, but she has mild symptomatic COVID. Does she need to be admitted because she's pregnant?
So I'll ask Manish to answer that question, and then Anjan, from whatever our experience is as far as pregnant women admitted in our COVID centers. So Manish, over to you.
As such, mild symptoms, even pregnancy is not an indication for admission. But we see that our national protocol gives us a lot of flexibility, a lot of freedom. So there may be many other clinical scenarios, permutations, combinations, and in those circumstances, there's something high-risk pregnancy or some complications in pregnancy in those circumstances with mild COVID. But as such, otherwise stable, mild COVID in pregnancy is not an indication for admission.
I think what Manish has said is perfectly fine. Earlier on, when the pandemic started, there was a guideline earlier that all positives have to be admitted. That was the time we had some pregnant women coming to us whom we admitted, but there is no reason for a pregnant patient whose test is positive, who's otherwise fit and healthy, should be coming to hospital to get admitted. And we really don't admit these patients. If they have a heart disease, they have pre-eclamptic toxemia, or they are having some other medical problem, let's say mitral stenosis or something. So those are admitted if they have symptoms which are not very good. Otherwise, no indication.
Right. Now the next question is again home isolation. So the patient had fever which resolved on day 5 and day 7 and then comes back on day 8 and day 9, which is something which is reasonably well known. The two questions are, why does this happen, and does this mean that the patient should get admitted? So fever that's coming back on day 8 and day 9 after a brief afebrile period. Why does it happen, and should the patient now be admitted?
Okay, so this is something that we are seeing, I think, more in the second wave, that patients who become all right and then suddenly again present with the febrile episode, and sometimes even the inflammatory markers go up, the CRP again starts rising. So maybe Neeraj can give his view on this, and we can have a discussion.
So yes, this has been a very common finding during this second wave, that this fever has been persistent type of. Sometimes it may persist, sometimes it will give a break of 24 to 48 hours to recur. So again, these patients who have second spike of fever, especially after 7th, 8th day, these are the people who needs closer observation. So if somebody has comorbidity, he or she should be admitted for observation, because there are very high chances that these patients might land up into what we know as cytokine storm. And this could be the early marker that inflammatory system is going rogue now, and we might have to intervene. So high-risk patient, ideally, they should be advised admission for close observation. Relatively younger patients who can be more closely monitored at home, maybe they can given an option. Okay, yeah, maybe low dose of steroid may be prescribed in such situation after assessing everything. But yes, persistent fever with beyond 7-8 days ideally should be either admitted preferably, or should be more closely monitored based on situation. And we might have to change our treatment strategy, because this is the set of population where we can actually intervene and make a difference by saving their lives by therapeutic options which we have at the moment.
So I see what we are seeing now is that patients who recovered, then suddenly after 2-3 days again start having a febrile episode. We've always said that this illness may have a biphasic sort of presentation, with initial viremia and then viremia coming down, and later on you're having more of a cytokine storm or a hyperinflammatory response happening. So it's possible that the fever that you're seeing in the second phase could be a hyperinflammatory response, and therefore these patients, as has been said, need close monitoring, because they may go towards hyperinflammatory situation with a cytokine release syndrome, and that is why one needs to monitor them more closely. Sometimes the fever actually comes after not only 2-3 days, but after about 5 to 7 days also, or even longer. We've seen patients where the fever has come after more than 10 days, and with the markers going up. Whether you call it a continuation of the ongoing disease, or whether it's after recovering, it's a sort of a post-COVID fever, But this does happen, and there are a lot of issues as to what is the cause of it. Is it ongoing cytokine storm, or has the virus gone away, but the dead virus is still there and it's causing an immune inflammatory syndrome also? But I think these are patients we need to really look at more closely. They can deteriorate rapidly, and here they should be observed or admitted. And I personally feel there is a role of considering them for starting steroids, because that sometimes makes a big difference because they are having an inflammatory response. Any addition that one would like to give? Any of the other panelists, if they have anything to say, or any other member from IMA, if they wanted to comment on, I think we can have a discussion.
Okay, if there is none, sir, then I'll just link that to two additional questions which come up from the discussion we've just had. How long does the patient actually remain infective after he's once become COVID positive? And I'll ask the next one after that.
Yes, I think Saurabh did mention this, but maybe he can address it again. Two issues. How long can your RT-PCR be positive, and how long can you be infective? They don't go hand in hand. So maybe Saurabh can try and answer that.
One thing is that the RT-PCR positivity. So if you see the data, now we have data from many studies, and have shown that RT-PCR may remain positive for weeks after one positivity. And sometimes there may be that like a patient is negative, but after 3 days is again positive, because probably it is related to the intermittent viremia virus viral shedding. And for patients who are immunosuppressed, for them this duration may be even longer. So that is one thing, that RT-PCR positivity may be even beyond 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and even beyond. If you have the case reports of even for 3 months, 4 months, patients having RT-PCR positivity. Regarding the infectivity, as far as I understand, the only study which showed the live virus which can be cultured, the maximum duration was around 8 days. So that's why this cutoff of, initially there was a cutoff of 14 days. Initially we had like 2 RT-PCR negativity, then we came down to 14 days, and now the 10 days. So probably this 10 days infectivity duration cutoff is fine for the large majority of individuals, that they may be infective up to 8 days while they are getting the live virus out. But after that, it is probably the dead virus which is coming positive on the RT-PCR test.
So in healthy individuals who have no fever, as was mentioned by Saurabh, you cross the 10 days and you haven't had fever for 24 to 48 hours, the chances of you being infective are less, and that is why it's said that you can come out of home isolation. However, if you are immunosuppressed and you have comorbidities, then you may continue to have some degree of viral replication for a longer period of time. In that setting, it may be worthwhile to really do the RT-PCR and see that you have become negative, because it's been documented that, say, patients with CKD who are on regular dialysis, or patients who are on immunosuppressant drugs, viral replication may persist for a little longer period of time, and there you have to be a little careful. But for the normal people who we advise home isolation, remember that these patients normally would be advised admission, but those who are healthy and advised home isolation, if they have been afebrile and you've crossed 10 days, then you really don't need to get them tested and they can come out of isolation.
Right, thank you, sir. The next question relates more to the practice of home isolation in a resource poor setting. So if you have a setup where there are no pulse oximeters, what are the surrogates that you can use to monitor the course of progress or deterioration?
So Manish, would you like to answer that? What can you, everyone may not have a home, may not have an oximeter at home, and this is going to be a big challenge in rural India. How do you do home isolation in rural India where oximeter is not available? What are the things that one can do?
So this issue has been addressed in the home isolation guidelines issued by the ministry. So it is not only about pulse oximeter, it is also about whether the patient gets dyspneic on walking around. It's not about 6-minute walk test as was discussed earlier. Even during the normal course of activity within the house, if a patient is moving around, a patient is talking to someone, is he getting dyspneic? That may be an early sign that he might be going into the immune phase of the disease, viral phase has progressed on. So that is one way. So connection to a healthcare worker is very important, who can talk to the patient and pick up these subtle findings. And it is very important also for the caregivers to be aware of these things. It is not like a bed rest sort of thing. A patient moves around in the home. He can, the caregiver, the patient himself can monitor if he's getting distant in doing the normal course of activity. And really this all has to be communicated to the healthcare provider. So this communication channel is very important to pick up subtle signs and to identify the patients who will require admission.
And a question continuing on this, Manish, is there are many cases which appear to be happy hypoxia, particularly in relatively areas where there is no pulse oximeter. So is there something else they need to do? How do you handle happy hypoxia in rural areas?
That is a challenge. Yes, we had seen in the first wave patients who even doctors came to us. They presented to the emergency with saturation of less than 80% because they were really not able to identify. So that difficulty will remain. But still, when the patient is monitored, and the patient himself is not able to really appreciate. But when he is monitored, the people around him, they can see if the patient is walking around, he's not able to talk, he's not able to talk in sentences, that is breaking down. So a close monitoring is the only solution that we have, short of a pulse oximeter.
Okay, coming back a little bit to drugs and prophylaxis, a couple of questions here on the prophylactic agents. This is secondary prophylaxis, basically patients who are already COVID positive, but to prevent deterioration. So can you recommend prophylactic colchicine, trypsin, chymotrypsin to prevent deterioration? Probably looking at a storm, prevention of a storm.
So there is a lot of two things. I think maybe Neeraj and maybe Manish to try and answer that, or Dr. Anant Mohan. One is can you have any markers or clinical signs which can predict an oncoming cytokine storm? And then are there any medication that can be given to prevent the occurrence of a cytokine storm in individuals? Is there anything like that? And that is why colchicine and all of these drugs are being used by a lot of people. So maybe Neeraj, then Manish and Anant could sort of then give their opinion.
So we have been talking about the close observation of such patients because it's the timing of administration of any drug that can save life. And over last 15 months, we have realized that oxygen, steroid, and anticoagulation, these are the three things which actually can save life. All other drugs which we are talking about, most of them are not going to help in any way, especially in preventing cytokine storm. So we have to be watchful. First sign of cytokine storm, that is worsening, say fever is persistent beyond 7-8 days, the patient has worsening cough, the saturation has started showing a downward trend. Say a patient's baseline saturation was somewhere between 95 to 98, now it's between 91 to 94. The respiratory rate is progressively increasing, the patient is finding it difficult to speak. Then these are signs when one can say, okay, patient is progressing into further immune phenomenon now. And that is when one can consider starting steroids. So if you ask me, so I think steroid is the only thing, if administered at right time, can prevent the patient landing up into a frank cytokine release syndrome. Otherwise, all other drugs which we are talking about, whether it's colchicine or whatever drug you are talking about, they have no proven benefit as far as prevention of progression of cytokine storm is concerned. And what we have seen over the last 15 months, that only these three things actually save life of most of our patients.
Right. So if they are taking steroids,
I think Manish wanted to say something.
Yes, sir. So as Neeraj rightly said, what are the early predictors, clinical predictors of progression to severe disease? So the current understanding, what data from the first wave has shown, around 28% of patients who have persistent symptoms beyond 7 days in the form of fever and high-grade fever or severe cough, they are likely to progress to moderate to severe disease requiring oxygen. So two clinical predictors are persistent fever for 7 days, or a fever which has disappeared comes back, and onset or worsening of a bad cough around the end of first week of illness. So these are the clinical predictors of severity. Now talking about the measures that can be done. So in the last, during the second wave also, we had these two agents which were introduced into the protocol. That was a strong NSA, like a naproxen, and was a inhaled budesonide. So these two agents were added to the armamentarium to address these patients who are having persistent symptoms. So these 30% of patients who are having persistent symptoms and are more likely to go into the severe illness. Regarding systemic steroids, I would say it was a desperate measure. Probably we had a very tough situation. Hospitals had run out of beds. Many people had to use oxygen at home. So under those circumstances, it was a very dire circumstances wherein these patients with persistent symptoms were given steroids. And I think we hope we don't have to repeat it again. Steroids should always be given within hospital setting, and all these patients who are having persistent symptoms are likely to go into severe disease should be hospitalized and managed.
Okay, Anand, anything you want to say before I ask Rajiv for the next question?
No, sir, I think I agree with the views because we don't really have much as far as prophylaxis is concerned. The colchicine as an anti-inflammatory is being used for many rheumatological disorders and as an anti-fibrotic also. And it was the Col Corona trial, which was the randomized trial that looked at colchicine for reducing the outcomes, preventing outcomes of corona, and it did not really work very well. So we don't have much as far as all these agents are concerned for management of COVID.
Okay, right. I agree with that. So you see, we really don't, we have certain markers which are clinical, like we've already said, persisting fever for beyond 7 days, fall in oxygen saturation, or if you don't have fall in oxygen saturation, a person who's getting breathless while even talking to you, or is not able to complete a sentence. And if the healthcare provider is monitoring him closely, these are subtle signs that he or she can pick up. These are markers which will suggest, these are parameters which will suggest that the person is actually going in from a mild to a moderate illness, and some intervention is required. Having said that, I think it's important to really be careful about when to start steroid. Like we've said, steroids can be useful, but starting them too early can also be very harmful. Even the recovery trial showed that it was of not much use or was more harmful if it was given early and was useful only in a later stage. So it's important to keep that in mind.
Right. So the question that next comes up about steroids itself, couple of them. One, is it really scientifically valid to give them at home? But if you do give them allow them to take it at home, and we're talking of oral steroids, not budesonide inhaled, do you need to taper them? So are there still situations where you would recommend oral steroids at home? And if you do recommend it, do they need to be tapered?
So I think Manish did answer it, but let me put it in a different manner. Now, considering the fact that we have come out of the second wave and we are not in a dire situation where people are taking oxygen at home, would you say that steroids should be taken in a home setting? So what is, Manish, over to you.
Yes, as I tried to point this out, so it was a very dire situation wherein it was used, and all these patients who probably who are having basically prolonged symptoms and have 30% likelihood of going into moderate to severe disease, they should be admitted under the current circumstances. And what was recommended was a very short course, 3 to 5 days without tapering. But what actually happened when we are analyzing the data, patients were given steroids at much higher dose for a much longer period, and even tapering for 2-3 weeks. So all those things had happened. But the guideline was for 3 to 5 days, a short course without tapering.
So
I think in the current situation, we should really not encourage steroids being given at home, because what we saw during the second wave was a lot of high dose steroids being given. I know one patient with Anjan also knows whose attendants gave him 500 milligram of methylprednisolone at home in terms of a pulse at home. So a lot of steroid misuse happened because of a panic situation. So I still feel that we should really discourage use of steroids at home. And if these patients deteriorate, their saturation is falling, they need admission, we should ideally admit them and then under supervision give them steroids.
Yes, sir.
Anjan wanted to say something.
Yeah, we are aware of few cases who got about 120 milligram of methylprednisolone presently at home, or 500 milligram. After this second phase goes off, I think that the government has to come down with some kind of guideline that steroids cannot be over-the-counter drugs, and if at all they have to be given, there should be a cutoff. Let's say 16 milligram of methylprednisolone or 6 milligram of dexamethasone. That's all. Beyond that, one should go to hospital. But after having said that, one must realize the patient's perspective. Going to a hospital is a big stigma at the present time. In the rural area, maybe it is not available. Maybe you got to travel for 100 miles or 50 miles to go to hospital. So some kind of a guideline that, well, this amount of steroids could be given at home for 3 to 5 days, as Manish has said, and then it is very necessary to be shifted at home. Should be on.
Right, sir. So we're going to move on a little bit to more medications on home isolation. Do the contacts need to take any drugs? Again, we're talking of prophylaxis now, but this is not primary prophylaxis of high risk exposure. Is there any role left of any of those earlier drugs, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin? Do contacts need to take anything in prophylaxis?
So Anand, would you like to answer that? We went from hydroxychloroquine to ivermectin. Certain states also distributed ivermectin on a weekly basis as prophylaxis. So what is the data?
Yeah, so again, last year, all these things had started because we did not know much. So hydroxychloroquine was used extensively, not only for patients, but also for the high-risk contacts. But again, as of now, we do not have any high quality or any clear-cut evidence of protection for secondary prophylaxis of the household contacts by hydroxychloroquine. And even for ivermectin, again, now ivermectin, we do not have robust data for patient or for prophylaxis, but there are almost a dozen large global trials going on right now. So what we are saying today, we might be changing our statements after a few weeks, who knows, because as far as efficacy is concerned, some studies have shown some benefit to the patient. As far as prevention is concerned to the contacts, there is less evidence of this kind of a prevention. But again, large studies are still ongoing globally. After those results come out, then we'll be probably in a better position to say so. But as of now, again, we really do not have any conclusive medication to offer to the general public, across the board, that if a person in a house has got this infection, then all the other family members can take this. So there is no clear-cut drug as of now available, pharmacology.
Right. Thanks, Anand. There are a couple of questions here which relate to radiology, blood investigations. We're not going to take them today. I'm just reminding the viewers that we have a specific talk or webinar on investigations, including radiology. Manish is going to be doing that 3 days from now. So we'll take these questions on that day. The next question, very specifically to home isolation again, and we'll continue with medications. It's good to get all of these off the table. Vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, role of any one of these.
So Neeraj, would you like to answer that?
So zinc, COVID has been taken as a sign of deficiency of zinc because everyone has been taking zinc, right? Even before getting COVID, everybody's on zinc supplement. So again, as Dr. Anjan said, excess of everything is bad. So there has been some report that zinc might be playing some bad effect on our immune response as well. But again, that is something which is, I will say, controversial. During the course of COVID-19, one can take zinc. There have been some studies which have shown that vitamin D may actually boost your immune system, and especially those who are deficient in vitamin D may benefit from taking vitamin D supplement. But again, these are based on very weak or negligible evidence, and one may or may not take these supplements, and overall, we don't think that's going to have much difference on the outcome of the patients. But yes, those who are deficient may consider taking these supplements, especially they may have role in those patients who are having this prolonged fatigue after recovery from the COVID, because all these micronutrient deficiency may be actually playing some role. So no definitive evidence. If one can take, very well. Otherwise, if somebody is not taking, then it's not going to make much difference.
Right. Thank you, Neeraj. And again, more questions on drugs. So obviously, the large number of drug questions you have, the fewer the drugs that work. Montelukast, antihistamines, aspirin. all in prophylaxis or secondary prophylaxis at home?
So Manish, what is your take
So
on?
the one problem that we have faced is polypharmacy. So we are having prescriptions which are running into 20 medications for a mild COVID patient, even at times asymptomatic COVID patients at home isolation. This is because of use of so many things, including all these, which are none of them have been shown to have any role, whether be it aspirin or the other things that you mentioned, even in secondary prophylaxis. As of now, nothing is proven. And we should avoid this polypharmacy because all these things are going to really affect the cause GI symptoms, running prescription running into 20 drugs. So we should stick to the 3-4 drugs that are well mentioned in our national protocol as well. I think that should be the thing. We should not be doing for so many drugs, none of which are proven.
Correct. So, the important thing here is that globally, if you look at it, majority of patients who've had mild symptoms or who fit into our home isolation have just been given symptomatic treatment. And their mortality is as low as ours is. So it's not that by giving polypharmacy, by giving Montelukast, by giving a lot of other medicines, including herbal medicines, we've done anything better. So I think it's important to remember that in majority, it is a self-limiting illness, just needs symptomatic treatment. It's only those who are deteriorating, who are having extensive pulmonary or extrapulmonary involvement, which needs admission, that we have to be able to pick them up early and admit them and start aggressive treatment. But for many who may have mild illness, who even may have asymptomatic disease, they don't take any treatment, they become all right on their own. So the focus should be only on symptomatic treatment rather than giving too many drugs, having a lot of drug-drug interaction, GI disturbances, and causing problems in the long run. I think that's something important that we need to keep in mind, because in a panic situation, you have prescription running into 2 pages where most of the drugs are really not required.
Right, sir. Another interesting question, I think we've had this once before also. 2 COVID positive patients in the same family, can they stay together in the same room or not?
Yes, so this is, maybe Anand can answer that. This is a question which someone had raised in another meeting, that should all COVID patients admitted be kept in an isolation, because one may be having the alpha variant and one may be having the delta variant. Will it not cause problem if the 2 viruses mix and cause a new variant? So Anand, what's your take on that?
Well, so technically, now that we know that there are multiple variants of this virus, then in an ideal world, yes, one would like to have them, separate. That is true, but we have to balance the logistics, and also there is no again science to say that there is, when they stay in the same room or something, then any severity is more, or one has a prolonged illness, or after becoming negative again he develops a relapse soon. So there is really no scientific basis right now, scientific evidence to that. It's a difficult question and one cannot give a clear-cut answer to this right now. But the variant thing also has just come up because now we know about all these variants. So these are discussions which are going around. But again, I would say one will really have to balance the logistics. If one has a multiple big mansion, then one can afford to do it. Otherwise, I don't think it is really required at this point of time in a real world setting.
Correct. I don't think it is required for 2 or 3 reasons. One, of course, is the fact that we need to have more data. That, you see, the variants usually develop when the virus, when it replicates and it sort of copies itself, there is a problem in that, and subsequent either a new variant develops, or there is a pressure of the vaccine that forces the virus to evolve itself. But normally it does not happen in a way that has been described. That what happened, for example, let's say influenza. When you have you have what we call an antigenic shift, that is, the virus changes dramatically. It usually happens when 2 different strains, could be of different origin also, come together in what is known as a reassortment vessel, where they have the potential of the virus mixing and causing a new or a novel virus to happen. Normally that doesn't happen in humans. And that is why even when we had the pandemic of swine flu, the reassortment usually in influenza happens in a swine, and that's where you could have an avian virus and a human virus being present in the swine at the same time, causing the reassortment or the antigenic shift to happen. So it's unlikely to happen. And as Anand said, in an ideal world, you could say that everyone needs to be in isolation. But the probability is very low, and that's why I don't think it's something that we need to be concerned about. Anjan wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think it could be extrapolated to a hospital setting also, and we've already had these kind of cases here. That would mean we could never keep patients who have come in on day one and then somebody else comes in the same ward. They should all be segregated. And the other issue is that if patients become negative in the hospital and they can't get shifted out for whatever reasons, they tend to press the panic button that he or she may be infected by another person with a different variant. So I think theoretically maybe right, but it is practically impossible to find out who is infected with variant and whether they should be isolating or not.
Yeah, it's also not possible to say whether X has got an alpha variant and Y has got a delta variant. And secondly, when a person becomes sort of negative, so if you have a ward where you have 100 people and say 80 are still positive and 20 have actually become negative, by staying in the ward, can they get reinfection? That is also not there. So these are issues which patients tend to raise, that if I'm now all right, I should be shifted to a non-COVID area. But anyway, these are sort of controversies which will continue.
Right, sir. So stretching this controversy, actually a very practical question that's come up is there's only one toilet at home, a single washroom at home. Can you still recommend home isolation? So Saurabh, you brought this up briefly in your description of the cases, but maybe is there a guideline on this? Can they use a single washroom?
So for home isolation, it is actually a prerequisite that the person should have a separate toilet, bathroom for the use. In case of like the second wave we had, where patients had to be isolated at home because there were no beds. So there were a lot of modifications to this protocol by the persons themselves, that they were kind of wearing an N95 mask, cleaning the bathrooms in between after a patient goes to a toilet, and then they disinfect it with the 1% bleach solution or alcohol-based solution, and then they kind of reuse it by the other people. But for an ideal setting, the separate washroom should be there, because it is not just the droplet or fomite, there is also airborne. So means the virus stays there, whichever area the patient is roaming around.
Right. I'll take another question that's come up on the same topic. This time it's on the chat. So it's obviously from the panelists, that if a couple is positive, one requires hospitalization, the other doesn't require hospitalization, would you recommend they both be hospitalized so that they can take care of each other?
So, okay, that's something that has happened very frequently. Anjan can answer that, because we've had this multiple times.
Yes, I think it's been a very interesting pandemic if you deal with couples who get positive, because the whole household nitty-gritties are shifted to a ward, and the husband doesn't want to be in the next bed as the wife, or some of them want to be close to each other. We've had at times, and at all times we would see that, and I don't plan to be a feminist, at all times we would see that the lady of the house was always cribbing about the man not eating well, or sleeping and not in the right way, or not taking medicine at the right time. After having said that, what we realized was that if we had a doctor couple and they were in a private room, then monitoring was slightly easier if we could have both husband and wife in a single room, because of being in a private room, and somebody was more comfortable that way because you had less of nursing things. They should not be put together unless it's indicated, but we've had some instances when a doctor couples have come into it, and we were slightly more comfortable for their monitoring. In the ward, it is slightly tougher. But if both husband and wife are there, at times they tend to, talk to each other much more, because they are at least two people who are without PPEs other than patients in the ward. At times it helps, but it all adds to the number of beds which are occupied. You can't really have a person coming in because they are their spouses, and because beds are at a premium. And all couple doctors whom we got it into private rooms, they were just an extra bed put into that room. They were not allotted a separate room per se.
Yeah, so I think it's an issue of bed availability and using a bed to optimum this thing. But if you have a private room and you have, let's say, a cot or something, then 2 positive patients, we've put many of them and they support each other, because there is a lot of psychological support which is required. If you're you just have to go into the COVID area, everyone is wearing a PPE and you're sort of in isolation. You just have your phone or your to talk to your friends and family, that's all. So it does help to have a family member along with you, but obviously in a surge, you can't afford to do that.
So we've crossed our normal time limit, but we'll take a few more questions before we close. And again, I'd like to remind the audience that we won't be taking questions which relate to topics that are not being discussed today. So things like cocktail therapy, remdesivir, which is not for home isolation therapy, will not be discussed today. We'll discuss them when we talk about these things tomorrow or the day after. Again, about isolation. So if the mother is positive and is lactating, is it okay to keep the child with her?
Yes, Neeraj, you could answer that. This is another thing that we've, okay.
So again, at the moment, if there is nobody to take care of that child, and then we will have to allow, but again, the risk and benefit has to be explained to the parents. And that's what we have been doing. So we have the other way around also, the child is positive, but mother or father is not positive. So there can never be a black and white answer. What is best for the family, that has to be taken into account, because if the child has no other place to go, then we have no other option. If the mother needs admission, she has to be in hospital. But again, if the patient is very sick, then that patient cannot take care of that child. So we have to basically see the overall situation and then take a call accordingly.
So if the mother is at home, you're allowing home isolation, then the guidelines really say that you should not, lactation should, breastfeeding should not be stopped, and the mother should be allowed to continue, but she should wear a mask while she's doing that. But if she's in hospital, then obviously you have no other option, because then it's not advisable to take a negative child or infant into the COVID area. But otherwise, it can be done. And as was mentioned, it's the other way around also. In the beginning of the pandemic and in between, we've had issues where the child was positive, but both parents were negative. Now we have to admit the child, but now who goes inside, and then what is the strategy that you should have? So like Neeraj said, there's no hard and fast rule. You really have to develop strategies as you go along, because if the child needs to be taken care of, then the mother can wear a PPE. You can teach her how to do that, and she can be allowed inside after explaining everything to her. Okay. There are 2 fingers that I can see. So let's say after. Yes.
Sir, could I? Yes. Sir, I'm a pediatrician, and we had certain problems when we were talking about child being positive and mother. We had cases like the parents have been shown to be positive, COVID positive, and children usually don't show so many symptoms, as you already know. So sometimes it does happen they are very reluctant to get the child being tested for RT-PCR, and they send the child to the grandparents. They stay with the grandparents, and it turns out that the child becomes positive, already positive, but being tested later on because child develops fever after 4-5 days. And that child is then, infecting the grandparents. So such cases have also been seen. So we always said that if the child is very small, very young, 2-3 years old, and if the parents are positive, invariably it does happen that because the child is staying with the mother till the time they know, the child has also become positive. So I think the best thing is let the child stay with the mother, taking all the precautions. The mother can take all the precautions, but keep the child with them. I think psychologically also that is much better.
Yes, yes. And I agree with you. This is what we have seen. I remember one family where both parents were positive. The child was asymptomatic. They sent the child to the grandparents. The child later on turned out to be positive, and the grandparents became infected. And unfortunately, one of the grandparents passed away because of severe COVID. So it was really unfortunate. And they kept saying that probably they should not have sent the child to the grandparents. But at that point in time, they were being protective towards the child. So I agree with that. Yeah.
There are 2 panelists who've raised their hands. Dr. Parul Vadgam, do you want to ask a question? You can unmute yourself.
Hello, sir. Yes, sir. I am from Surat. I am JDN Secretary, national level. Sir, my question is, sir, we have used many times budesonide, inhalation budesonide in mild patients. Sir, our response with the mild patient is really good, and we have been a part of the trial because I'm a chest physician and a professor in Government Medical College. So my question is, what is your opinion about utilizing it in a moderate or a severe COVID patients?
So use of budesonide in moderate to severe patients along with this oral steroids that you're giving.
Yes, sir.
Manish, would you like to answer that, or you can ask Anant also to answer that?
So yes, nebulized steroids we have been using nebulized steroids, budesonide, in these patients with moderate to severe disease, particularly in patients who are having severe cough, and to good effect. Yes.
Correct. So I think our experience has also been the same, that inhaled steroids also are effective, and probably they have a little bit of a better local action, both in
Yes.
terms of decreasing the cough and sometimes giving better relief as compared to the oral steroids. So even if you're giving oral steroids, it may be worthwhile to continue with the nebulized steroids also.
Okay, sir. So, so because we have quite studies, good number of studies for mild cases, sir, moderate or severe cases, we have not yet got enough evidence.
Correct. But I think we have been doing that. Maybe Anand can also add on to that, but we have probably followed this as a protocol in terms of continuing with the inhaled steroids.
Okay, sir. Okay, thank you, sir.
There's a hand raised. I can't see your name. MOHFW. Yes, sir.
Yeah. I'm Dr. Abul Hassan, IMA JDN chairman. I have actually posted my question in the chat also, that in some of our patients on home isolation, diarrhea is the predominant problem. In spite of our advice to rehydrate themselves with the oral rehydrating solutions and other medications, they continue to be troubled with it. They get daily, they give us calls that it is not getting controlled, it is not getting controlled. Some of them go to the extreme of getting somebody's help in getting IV fluids at home also. That's also happening. So what is your advice regarding this issue?
Okay, Neeraj, would you like to answer that? This has been seen also that you have diarrhea which happens as a part of COVID.
So normally this type of diarrhea persists for 3 to 5 days, and of course hydrating such patient is very important. And if diarrhea is so severe that the patient is requiring IV fluid, then that patient should not be kept into home isolation and should ideally be shifted to hospital setting. And such patients may be given a trial of, say, Imodium type of thing, which can actually, after you are sure that this is the cause of diarrhea is nothing other than COVID, then this may help by increasing the bulk of the basically the stool, as well as you can ask the patient to take probiotic. Even curd is going to help in such situation. So if somebody is requiring IV fluid, then that patient should be shifted in hospital and should not be advised taking IV fluid at home.
Okay.
Right. There's a raised hand,
Yes.
Dr. Sanjeev Singh Yadav.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Dr. Sanjeev Singh Yadav from Hyderabad. I do a lot of proctology work. In this recent 6 months, I have seen many patients coming to me with HB 3 to 8 grams in between. And this is because of the hemorrhoidal plexus bleeding, which they have got. Mostly what I think is they might have taken a lot of this kara preparation, a lot of gastric disturbances also have come. In these cases who are COVID positive, it was very difficult for us to make them understand that surgery is not possible now. But sometimes we had to do a procedure because the blood loss was almost every day becoming more than wanted. So any advice in this regard?
So I think there is an article which I read which also had said that too much of kara is actually causing GI disturbing and GI bleed, both upper and lower GI bleed. So like we said, polypharmacy, which could include even an alternate medicine, sometimes can cause more harm, and it can lead to erosive gastritis. It can lead to worsening as far as your hemorrhoids are concerned. So I think that prevention is better than cure. But yes, a lot of intervention, surgical intervention in COVID positive patients may be associated with higher morbidity. because of the inflammatory response which is seen in COVID, and sometimes there's also compromise as far as the lung function are concerned. So one would really try and avoid a lot of aggressive surgical intervention. Any comments from any of the panelists? Maybe Anjan, if you'd like to say anything.
Yes, I think, all these non-allopathic medications, and not to be going into any controversy regarding Ayurveda and allopathy as per today's scenario, people tend to follow it a bit more religiously. You tell somebody to take one capsule of antibiotic 3 times a day for 5 days, it's not done. But if you tell him to take kara 3 times a day, he takes 5 times a day for the next 20 days and gives it to his father and mother also. Because it is generally thought that these drugs don't have side effects like homeopathic medicines. This has to be put across that everything would have a side effect. I'm aware of so many patients who had an upper endoscopy done because of these karas. So if at all you have to take it, let it not be very hot, because people think taking hot things will kill the virus in the upper airway or maybe the upper esophagus or the throat or the nasopharynx. So let's not do it. And this is one thing which we have to go and tell everybody not to overdo it.
Right. Madam, you wanted to ask something.
Sir, I was just talking about diarrhea, which was said loose motions. In so many of our patients, we had foul smelling loose motions. And when the test was done, there was a lot of pus cells and of course bleeding also. In small children I'm talking about, and even in adolescents. So in that case, can we use antibiotics at this time? Because maybe it is secondary to viral infection. So that might help controlling the diarrhea, because in kids it is very difficult to rehydrate and keep them.
So if you suspect a superadded infection causing it, then there is obviously, then one should consider giving an antibiotic.
Right, sir. So we've reached beyond what we'd anticipated. We've also reached the end of the questions. There are some which are repeated. So the videos of all these discussions are generally available on the ministry website, and they're also put up on the AIIMS website, the AIIMS YouTube channel after a few days. So the repeat questions, you'll find the answers if you go through them. There's one specific question which I'm not going to ask, which says, what are your views on Corondil? So I'm not going to ask you that question, and I'm not going to ask you to answer that question. I'll leave it to you to wind up, sir.
So two things, Rajiv. One is, of course, there is one question I saw which was on monoclonal antibodies. And since that is also something that is indicated in mild disease to prevent people from going into moderate disease, especially the elderly and comorbidities, we'll take it up in the next time. But it's something of interest because it's something that is now available, although it's expensive treatment, but it's available in our country, and therefore worthwhile to address what is its role and the fact that it's currently not in the guidelines. But at the end, I would like to, I saw Dr. Jay Lal also, the president of IMA, was there, and if he's there, I would really we'd like him to really give his comments before we close the session. So if Dr. Lal is there, maybe if he can just give his comments. Because we were trying to get him in the beginning, but I think he was not there. I did see him for some time, but I'm not sure whether he's there right now.
He's logged in, but I don't see him visible. He is still logged in. So maybe he's not at the console.
Okay, so we'll try and see if we can get him to give his comments in our next webinar. Maybe then we can ask Rajiv, you can then, for the vote of thanks and closing remarks, we can ask Ms. Padmaja Singh from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare to give the vote of thanks.
So that was a huge interest that was generated in the webinar. There were almost, I was looking at the questions, even now we have 78 Q&As that are there. So there's a lot of invaluable guidance that has been provided today to the doctors. And I hope they're able to carry this forward to the into the cascade trainings that they had. I would like to thank on behalf of Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Dr. Guleria, Dr. Anjan Trika, Dr. Anant Mohan, Dr. Manish Soneja, Dr. Neeraj Nischal, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, for absolute clarity and patient answering of all the questions. Dr. Saurabh Mittal, who gave the presentation earlier. And I would also like to thank Professor Jailal, who helped us reach out to almost 225 doctors today. With that, sir, our deepest gratitude to the panelists and to the participants today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again tomorrow at 3. These are 4 webinars, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Tomorrow is the one on medical therapy, primarily on drugs to be used when the patient is in hospital. Dr. Richa Agarwal, who's handling the admitted patients in trauma center, along with Professor Trika and the rest of the people, will be doing that talk. So we'll see you tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Good.